This theme is an hour and a half, and it's meant to be introductory. We want to provide a foundation of general knowledge, but not to have participants learn all the details about how children develop. Parents should come away with understanding the concept of developmental milestones and that children's development scaffolds and builds on each other. The main purpose of this class is for participants to understand that children who have experienced separations, loss, and trauma will likely be behind in one or more area of development. This is natural and should be expected given their life experience. But stable and attuned parenting will be a major key in helping them to catch up. There are cornerstones of the NTDC curriculum that participants will refer back to long after class is over, and this class has one of them. The Randy activity is likely one of those that people are going to remember, so consider it one of the main takeaways from this theme. So let's get into the nuts and bolts. This theme begins with a podcast by Dr. Bruce Perry, who you're going to see in a lot of the curriculum because he's an international expert and parents really do find him relatable. So the podcast covers normative child development and then layers in how childhood adversity impacts normative child development and delays it. It's a pretty long podcast though, so we're going to talk in a minute about troubleshooting those. So after the podcast, you're going to spend time talking about the various developmental domains and milestones. There's going to be lots of slides and handouts to do that. But the key is not to give the details of each slide or handout. The art will be to use the examples to teach the concept that children have expected milestones that they're going to be reaching at specific age ranges. So first, you're going to use an age example. In this case, it's middle childhood, and you're going to match that up with the milestones in different domains. Next, you'll use another example, this time of one domain, and you're going to follow the milestones through that the child will reach in that domain at any given age range. For example, in this slide, we're going to see how language starts in infancy with cooing and babbling, and then it moves up to fully understanding language by the time a child's in middle school. This will be followed by a handout specific to sexual development to acknowledge that it is also part of typical development. The goal of this section is to help participants know where to look if they want to gauge a child's developmental age in certain areas, not to memorize all the developmental milestones. We just want them to be able to detect if a child is showing delays. And if they are, then they could get professional help. Now we're going to get into a conversation and show slides about how trauma, including separations from primary caregivers, can impact a child's development. You'll refer participants to another series of handouts on parenting tips for different age ranges and a handout on development across the ages. And now we're going to get into the Randy activity that I mentioned, and this is going to take up the last portion of class. The Randy activity hits home the concept of children having different developmental levels in various developmental domains by the example of a real child that we call Randy. First, you're going to read a vignette, but you're not going to give the child's real age, and you're going to go through a series of descriptions of this child in 7 different domains, give these behavioral examples, and then pause each time to ask the class what age the child is. And we've created an instructional video for you on this activity so that you can see exactly how to do this. You're going to notice that the participants will give you a different age range every time you read a slide, and it's only at the end that you're going to reveal that the child is actually 13 years old chronologically. And then you'll show a photo which allows for them to see that all of the younger ages that they guessed are not actually who they would see if they actually were parenting this child. This activity highlights the realistic parenting characteristic that we talked about at the beginning of the theme and that parents will definitely need to develop around child development. Lastly, every theme has a reflection relevance activity. They're almost always at the end. And in this particular theme, we're going to ask our prospective parents to reflect on what it would be like for them to parent this actual child, Randy. Now let's talk about the key takeaways for this theme. Participants should walk away understanding that while all children develop at their own pace, when they experience separations, loss, and/or trauma, it usually delays their development in one or more areas. And because there's several domains of development, any or all of them could be impacted by a child's life experience. This can look really confusing in real life if a child looks a certain age, but they don't act it. Parents need to know that it's not intentional or manipulative, but it's because of their life experience. So they need to recognize where children are not developing at their chronological age and adjust their expectations and parent them according to the age that they actually are developmentally, not chronologically. You might have heard this referred to as parenting to the stage, not the age, which is a key component of parenting a child who's experienced separations, loss, and trauma. Now let's talk about a few tricky areas you might encounter. The first is the podcast. So anytime there's a podcast in a theme, be mindful that most of us can't keep sustained attention just through our auditory sense. So give them an area to focus on. Like maybe you could ask them to write notes or take a list of key points, which would help them to focus their attention. When you give people tasks, it can actually give them something to do that helps them to learn, like maybe even filling in a blank line that they're listening for, a particular concept, like completing a sentence. Also in this theme, there's a glossary to accompany the podcast. So you could give them any task around the glossary, like circling the word anytime they hear it while the speaker's talking. Another section to be mindful of is the developmental domain section. First, we need to make sure that our participants understand the term. It's an area of development, like social development or emotional development. And so use examples to really make this come alive if people don't seem like they're getting it. All children develop at their own pace, and so we want to reinforce that normative development has variations. Don't get into that too early because it's later through the Randy activity that we're going to introduce how a child's development can be so severely impacted in all the different domains, or at least some of them, given his separation and trauma experience. So hold yourself back, hold participants back, let everyone know that we're going to get there if they bring it up too early. Another area to be mindful of is when you have handouts, point them out, but don't dive into them deeply, and especially in this particular theme, because there's so many handouts that they could never digest. It's really for them to be able to go back to reference later. Remember that sexual development is a normal part of child development, and we want to make sure that participants feel that way in the way that we're delivering this information. So chat with your co-facilitator in advance, and whichever of you is more comfortable with this should be the one to lead it so that it comes out really naturally and participants feel comfortable with this being a part of typical child development. It's not meant for you to spend any more time on than any other domain. Just treat it like all the other milestones, and give the advice that if children need extra support in this area, just like any other domain, that they should go ahead and seek professional help. And again, make sure you refer them to the right time. Okay, so this is a foundational theme. It does just that. It lays the foundation for learning about all the other foundational themes and what's typical for children. We want to do that before we get into what's atypical and concerning about behaviors, challenges, or strategies. So this is our opportunity to show that children who have experienced separations, loss, and trauma are normal children. The child development theme lets participants begin to see that life experiences are the only thing that makes these children different from other children. They have all the potential in the world when they can catch up with nurturing, attuned, and stable families.